Hey there, we're getting started with this week's Ask Me Anything. No other gods before me, Christianity and other religions. So I'm going to share it now. And if you were here last week, we did a question on why do people think so differently? And I think that went fairly well. At this point, it has almost 800 views. So it seems like this is the sort of thing that people are interested in. And so who I am, I'm John Topping. I'm an apologist for the Ultimate Questions team with Power to Change Students. And if you are interested in having apologetics at your church or your school group, you hear this and you think maybe this is the kind of thing that would work at your group, please do get a hold of us. We'd love to come talk at your group and be able to meet all of you. So let's get this shared here. There. And so this week on the Ask Me Anything, you can submit any questions for this. It's called Ask Me Anything. So you can submit any questions about Christianity or faith-based related things, anything at all. The reason we have a topic is just to kind of keep things organized a little bit. So we'll focus a little bit on this, but if you have a question that's totally off topic, that is quite welcome. You can post your comment below in the comment section, and we'll be able to receive that and hopefully get into that. So yeah, ask lots of questions. We'd love to have you be part of this discussion. So one of the questions that we had last week that we didn't have time to get to is someone asked the question, how do you handle when someone is near death and not a believer? How do you approach the topic of trying to share Christianity with them? Because last week I had mentioned that people like a direct approach, that if you kind of beat around the bush and kind of mention that you're Christian, they just kind of hear religious stuff and kind of tune out. But if you're direct about it and just ask somebody a question like, hey, where do you think we're going when we die? Right? Try to bring it up in a polite way. But if you just ask a question like that, people tend to be very receptive, a lot more receptive than kind of the beating around the bush approach, which is kind of counterintuitive to what we would think. So one of the questions that came in was, if someone's literally near death at that moment, just say you're visiting them in the hospital and they're on their deathbed, that seems kind of awkward to ask them, hey, so what do you think happens when we die, right? So how do you approach the topic in that situation? And honestly, I'd probably stay with the same answer, handled a little bit differently, though. But so if you're talking to somebody on a plane, so whenever I fly, I like striking up a conversation. If the person's totally disinterested, follow the social cues, right, and don't pursue. But a lot of the time they're interested. And so in that situation, I would just say, oh, hey, so, I'm interested in religion and faith-based stuff and spirituality. I like asking people about their views. What do you think happens when we die? Right? That would be the way I would approach it. If I'm talking to somebody on their deathbed, I'm not just going to bring it up as an interesting point of conversation to discuss, right? But I would still bring up that topic. So in that situation, you might be talking to them like, wow, this is scary. Like, this is incredibly powerful. What's happening right now. Like, you might actually die soon. So do you think you're ready for that? Like, what do you expect is going to happen? Like, have you thought a lot about this? And approaching it in more of a, this is a really important question sort of way. In that case, I think in most cases, a person who's near death is thinking about that a lot, probably. And if they're not, it's because they're deliberately trying to avoid thinking about it. If you bring up the topic, it might be exactly what they need. It might be a welcoming thing to them that they're like, yes, please, I need to talk about this right now. And even if they're a little bit put off, thinking like, no, that's the last thing I want to think about, it still might be good for them to do that, obviously, right? So just approaching that in that gentle sort of a way, treating it as this is incredibly meaningful, and I'm not trying to kind of diminish the importance of this, but I really think this is important for us to talk about. My dad is a pastor, was a pastor for over 40 years, and he's talked to many people on their deathbed. And people really think about death when they're approaching it, right? So the person who's avoided talking about that their whole life, when their time comes, they want to talk about it. And a lot of times they are willing to listen to the gospel message during that time. So even if it seems uncomfortable, it might be uncomfortable. But I would say to ignore that opportunity would actually be a very bad thing. So we have questions based on our topic today. We're talking about religion, Christianity and other religions. Any questions are welcome, but that's kind of the rough area we're going to be going into. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot, this is a question that the majority of people have thought about, and that comes up a lot in circles of evangelism, is people say, aren't all religions basically the same thing? Don't all religions kind of teach the same moral values, have the same concept of an afterlife? Don't they all say pretty much the same thing? And in that case, what's the difference with Christianity? What's the point in even looking into Christianity and discussing these things? As long as I'm a good person, I'm probably going to be okay, right? And that's the assumption a lot of people have, and the question comes up, what's the difference with Christianity? Is there a difference? And I think there's a real major difference that sets Christianity apart from basically any other religious view, and that's the topic of how we are saved. The concept of, if I'm a good enough person, I'll be okay, is in basically every other religion. You do enough good stuff and you'll make it to heaven. Right? You do enough good things and you'll be good in God's eyes. You can have a good relationship with God. Something pleasant awaits you on the other side, or something like that. And Christianity says basically the exact opposite. It says you can never do enough good to earn favor in God's eyes. We've already messed up as the human race and as individuals. There's never going to be enough good things that we can do to earn God's good graces. And so what Christianity says is you need to actually repent. That's the whole point. It's not just, okay, let me do better, but you need to actually come before God and say, hey God, I recognize I can't do it on my own. Please help me. And that's the whole point of Jesus. Right? I know my wife, before she became a Christian, her understanding of what Christianity was about was, it's sad some guy had to die. That was the gospel to her. And when she finally understood, no, it's not just sad some guy had to die, it's that Jesus willingly paid the price that we owe, that it became meaningful to her, and she just started crying when she really understood what that meant. And how it wasn't just, oh, yeah, I need to be a decent person. It was, I've failed, and I can recognize that I've failed. And God is actually willing, extending his hand to forgive me and change me. Like, that's a big difference here. So the difference with Christianity is the concept of forgiveness and the cross of Christ. And this actually fixes the problem of human sin. Where other religions might say something like, okay, you do enough good and it counterbalances. You get the weights, right? Here's your good deeds, here's your bad deeds. And if your bad deeds are really weighing you down, then just do more good deeds and it'll balance out and hopefully tip the scales in your favor. Where Christianity says, it doesn't matter how many good deeds you've done, the bad deeds always outweigh it. And if that doesn't make sense immediately, you can think of it in terms of a judge with a criminal. If the criminal has done something and it's proven that the criminal is guilty of the crime, it doesn't matter how much good things the criminal does. It's not going to change the fact that they've committed a crime and have to pay the price for that crime. Right? It doesn't matter. If you go before the judge and you say, oh, but I've done lots of community service, I've given a lot of money away to charities, the judge says, yeah, that doesn't change the fact that you're guilty. Right? What Christianity says is not that God is out there saying, okay, I want you to do enough good things to earn my favor. It's saying God loves us so much that he has actually entered in and said, hey, I know you need saving. I will go out of my way to bring salvation to you. I'm actually going to pay for it myself. I'm going to suffer on your behalf. I'm going to give my life for you to save you. That's what Christianity says, which is a very different sort of approach to how this problem is dealt with, where the problem is actually fixed and fixed outside of ourselves. So that's a big difference between Christianity and other sort of religious viewpoints. And so another question that gets asked often is this one about miracles. So when we look at other religions, you see Christianity, sometimes Christians will say, oh, well, I know Christianity is true, God's done this in my life. And so a question comes up, well, what about when other religious people that aren't Christian tell me the same thing, that they've seen miraculous things happen in their life? How do you deal with that? a few answers for this. First of all, I think the examples of supernatural things happening in non-Christian circles are actually a lot more rare than we would think, than we would give credit for. Where it's always treated, oh, well, all religions have supernatural claims and they're all kind of the same. I would argue Christianity far outweighs non-Christian religions in terms of supernatural claims happening today in people's lives. As an example of this, I've talked with lots of people from different religious backgrounds. In all my talks, I have met one person. I believe it's only one person. I might be wrong, but I think I've only ever met one person that would say they had a supernatural event happen in their life. It was a Muslim I met. It was basically a Muslim evangelism seminar where they were trying to preach Islam to people and help people understand Islam and possibly convert. And so very nice people. And so I went for the sake of interest and for the sake of dialogue and chatting with people there. And so the guy shared a story with me, one of the guys, where he had a dream where Allah had spoken to him. And he felt that Allah had told him something and that had impacted him in a spiritual way. And that's the only case I've ever heard from somebody where I talk with people from other religious perspectives where they've said they've had some sort of supernatural event happen in their life. That's the only time. I've gone to different religious services, so of people that I disagree with, right? I went to a Mormon service one time. And so, and if you're interested in Mormonism and Christianity and whatnot, we'll be doing that in a future week. But I went to a Mormon service. And in the Mormon service, I wanted to hear a Mormon preacher to see how the service and the sermon differed. It just so happened I wasn't in luck because it was testimony day at the Mormon service. So there were different people from their congregation getting up and sharing how they had converted to Mormonism, how it had impacted their life, that sort of thing. If I were to do that in a Christian circle, every case of somebody sharing their testimony would at some point involve God got a hold of my life, He saved me, I feel forgiven now, where my sins are forgiven, and I'm no longer feeling guilty and ashamed of my past, because I know God now and I've experienced God. That would be part of the testimony. At this Mormon service, that didn't happen in even one of the testimonies. Every single testimony was completely naturalistic in the sense of all it was I was going through a hard time and good old Joe over there, he helped me out. He gave me a job and now I've met a nice girl and got married and I'm part of this awesome church. Somebody else gets up and says, yeah, I was an alcoholic, my kids wanted nothing to do with me, and I got involved with the church here. Some people came to my door and started chatting with me. I had them in for tea and just changed my life where I'm part of a community now. Every one of the stories had a similar case like that. There was nothing supernatural in it. There was nobody talking about God even, of how God had impacted their life. It was very naturalistic. When I talk with people from other faiths, I like asking the question, what has God done in your life? Because the supernatural events are very meaningful to us. A lot of the time I get kind of a blank stare and kind of a hum and a haw, like they know they should have an answer, but they don't. So I teach at a Bible college. I teach at a Bible school. It's basically training people to go into ministry for the most part. When I do a class on miracles, I actually just did this the other day on Monday. Every year I like asking the students, how many of you have seen a miracle or had God move in their life some way? Where they've felt the presence of God, had God move in their life, or they've seen a miracle. Every year, pretty much every single hand goes up. And then I asked them, I'm going to be doing that this next week. If you're watching today and you're in my apologetics class, this is what we're doing next class for the beginning of it. I asked them, can you share some of those stories with me? And we just go around for about 20 minutes or 30 minutes or so, just sharing stories. And it's basically always the case where there's too many stories to even share within that time frame, where I kind of have to cut it short to get on with material, where just everybody's had that sort of thing from a Christian perspective. And so why do miracles happen in other faiths? For largely, I would say they probably don't in the same way that Christians experience them. But we do experience that at times where people from other faith perspectives do experience things. This happens a lot when you get into more spiritual or mystic sort of religious backgrounds, or people that are involved in the occult. This sort of situation. And most of the time, when I hear these sorts of stories of, like, not people that I've met, because when I ask people, they don't typically have these stories. But when I read about these sorts of stories, a lot of the times it sounds either that, like, it can be explained through human psychology. So, for example, sleep deprivation, food deprivation, and it's being treated as more of a monastic lifestyle, and then they start having visions, where I would say you go through intense either physical trauma or deprivation, you do experience things. That's just what happens to the human body. Where other cases, religion, to have a religious experience involves drugs. Or, on the other hand, when I do talk to people, when I do read about people's experiences, and they mention the different things that have happened, a lot of times when I hear it, from my perspective, and I recognize this is my bias as a Christian, but from my perspective, I hear it and I think, that sounds kind of demonic. It sounds kind of like you're trying to interact with the dead and have experiences with spirits and get them to do cool things for you and give you experiences, rather than really trying to have a relationship with the divine. So that's been from what I've read, the feeling that I've been given through that. Worst case scenario, from a Christian perspective, right? We meet somebody who has legitimate religious experiences. It doesn't sound demonic. It doesn't sound like a sleep deprivation or something like that, where they've had a legitimate experience. What do we do then? In those cases, being an apologist, I think the best thing to do is weigh the evidence. Look into the religion a little bit more. Do the doctrines actually make sense? Are they coherent? Are they evidenced? Is the religion actually based on facts or evidence or argumentation, or is it just an interesting thing to believe that some people believe? And that leads into our next question, which is when we meet people from other religions, or if we aren't religious ourselves and we're weighing the different religions, how do we evaluate truth claims made by other religions, made by religions in general? And I think this gets a little bit back into what we discussed last week and the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. So it gets a little bit into that, where religious claims from my perspective, seem to be making objective claims. It's either true or it's false. But oftentimes we treat them as subjective claims of, oh, it's just what's meaningful to you. How do we actually weigh the religious claims that people are making? Treat them as objective claims. Treat them as things that can be researched and evidenced and actually looked into and test those claims. I've told students before that if something can't withstand scrutiny, it doesn't deserve to be believed. And I think that's same in all religious circles, Christianity included. If you weigh the evidence and you look at the claims being made and you start applying scrutiny, you start applying reasoning and argumentation, you start giving counters to it, and it's just kind of like oh, well, just have faith, that doesn't work, right? If a Christian, I've known different Christians, different Christian students that have asked these questions of their religious leaders, and they just kind of get a pat on the head. Oh, just have faith. If that's what your religious leader says, leave that religious leader and find somebody who will actually discuss these things with you. In the Christian church, I know there are people out there. That's what I do as a job. People on my team do that as well. I know lots of pastors do that. So actually look into these matters and see if, actually do the work, do the research, and look into these to see if it follows the evidence. And I would recommend on that note, don't just ask people that are of like minds as you. If you're asking challenges, just say you're asking challenges of Christianity. Don't just talk to your atheistic friends about, oh, well, what are the answers to this? Oh, yeah, stupid religious people, haha, right? If you're asking questions about Islam, you don't ask Christians and say, oh, yeah, what's the Muslim answer to that? Oh, yeah, stupid Muslims, haha. Ask the person who believes it. Ask them what they believe and why they believe it. And if you don't get a good answer and you research it and you can't find something, it seems like those truth claims can't be backed up. And this is where I find the difference with Christianity. Another big difference is that Christianity is built on real historical claims, Where other religions are typically just somebody goes off, has a religious experience, and comes back and starts teaching people these new ideas that can't be proven. So you just have to trust them. Where Christianity, that happened, Jesus came and he gave us truth claims, and he asked us to trust him, but it's also based on the historical evidence that Jesus actually died and then rose again. And so when you look into that evidence, I've brought that up to secular people before, and they say, that seems more convincing than I thought it would be. Look into that and see Christianity actually stands its ground in terms of being supported by evidence. So we have a question as a comment on the video. How do you communicate that the Christian God is the only God to a person who believes that the Christian God might be just one of many gods? Good question. So in this case, sometimes in different, and I use this term broadly, but sometimes Eastern religions will just adopt Jesus as another God. So I'm guessing that's where this person is coming from. And so, for example, when Christian missionaries went to India, started going there a while ago, they would get there and they would say, oh yes, I enjoy this Jesus, I will adopt him. And they say, oh great, I've made a convert. Not so. Right? So how do we discuss this truth that Christianity is the only truth? One thing to look into is the claims that are made by different religions. If somebody says that they're both a Muslim and a Christian, let's look at the claims by both those religions. They're mutually exclusive, meaning both of them can't be true at the same time. Either one's true and one's false, or one's false and one's true, or they're both false. You can't have both of them being true at the same time. So then you start looking into the claims and say, like in this case, saying, seems like one of these two things are true. Let's objectively look at the evidence of which one stands up. Right? In the case of somebody who's just say a Hindu and saying, I adopt different religions, or as another example, if somebody practices Shintoism, they will oftentimes, and again, this is speaking broadly, this is a broad brush, I'm not saying this is true of everyone, but oftentimes they will treat it less about reasoning through things, and for in the example of Shintoism, more about aesthetics, more about the artistic aspect of it, or the poetry behind it, the meaning behind it, rather than the objective truth behind it. Other religions, like just say in Buddhism, you might even find somebody that doesn't think we should reason through these things, where it's not about being reasonable. Right? In this case, I actually find this to be one of the most difficult questions, because if somebody doesn't want to reason through things and objectively look at the evidence, then it's hard to come to any sort of conclusion. It's basically just go with whatever feels best to you, which is entirely subjective. And I would argue that's if you close the door on reasoning and rationality and argumentation, you close the door on thinking. And if you're saying, I'm not willing to actually think about this, it's really hard to have dialogue at that point. At that point, I try arguing for it objectively, as best I can, and saying, I understand your perspective that you don't appreciate the objective rationality behind faith-based claims, but I do, so here's a little bit about why I think Christianity might actually be objectively true. And so one way you can do that is by looking, address this issue of communicating the fact that Christianity is the only true religion, is looking at the claims made by Jesus, where Jesus says different times, like for example, one time he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Famous passage. Jesus treated it as though he was the only method. It wasn't as though, oh, just do enough good and it'll work out okay for you, or well, just worship God in whatever capacity you feel okay with and it'll work out. He made very strong claims that his was the only way to salvation and that other ways weren't going to be good enough. So yeah, addressing those sorts of claims and saying, so what do you make of Jesus? If you think that there are other ways to salvation, or that we should look at other gods and other religions, and they can both be true at the same time, or something like that, what do you make? How do you make sense of what Jesus said? Do you think he's wrong? And if so, why? Like, it seems to be that he's making a very strong claim there. If he's wrong, then he's either lying, or just completely mistaken, or manipulating people, or he's nuts, or something like that. But when we look at the data about Jesus' life and his death and resurrection, that really seems to counteract a lot of that. Okay, we have another question here. How can we be certain about truths about faith-related things, about religious claims? How can we be certain about those things? I've discussed the arguments for Christianity with someone before, and I didn't notice it until after the conversation. I was really annoyed when I realized what was happening and thought, oh, I wish I had said that, right? But I was talking with somebody, and I was giving them arguments for Christianity. And they came back with, well, yeah, that seems really good, but it still could be false. Like, I want something that seems certain to me, that seems certain, like you can't doubt it. I don't want to have faith in something, just blind faith. I want something to be certain for me. And after the fact, I realized what was happening there, where they were wanting a certain type of argument. They were wanting something that couldn't be doubted. They were wanting something like a deductive proof. Deductive piece of reasoning where they could agree with all the premises and the premises necessarily imply the conclusion. In that sort of a case, I think that's asking too much. And I think it's asking too much of anyone for basically anything. For example, in science, we do not arrive at certain truth. We arrive at inferences. We use inductive reasoning almost entirely when we do science. And so inductive reasoning doesn't arrive at absolute certain proof. It's really good. We can do really good work, and we definitely know things through science. Like, welcome science. It's amazing. It takes us to the moon. It gives us cell phones. But to say that it gives us certainty is a mistake, because any sort of scientific theory that's out there is what's called falsifiable. It could be proven false. There could come about something, or we say, oh, we actually had that misunderstood a little bit. And we see that happen all throughout scientific history, where people get proven wrong. They have really good ideas, they advance science, they advance technology, but then something gets proven wrong. They say, oh, well, let's make our theories better. Basically, all things that we learn in life are like that. They're based on what's called abductive reasoning, where it's given all the evidence that we have, what's the best explanation we can give? If we do that with faith-based things, which we do it with even science, so why ask more of religion than you would even ask of science? If we do that with religion and we say, we have all this evidence, we've done our work, we've done our research, we have all this evidence, what's the best explanation? I think it's Christianity. And so what the saying, yes, but I can still doubt. I can still doubt the claims that you're making. Yes, you can, but if the best explanation is that Christianity is true, and you don't want to believe that just because it's possible for you to doubt, then you're actually not going where the evidence leads. In fact, I would say you're deliberately believing something that seems less likely to be true. So if you deliberately want to believe something that doesn't go where the evidence leads, I would say that's irrational. Where if you look at Christianity, you follow the evidence where it leads, you look at the argumentation, you follow just say something like the resurrection argument, really seems like Christianity is true. We have another question here. And I think this will be our last one. Okay, big question to have in the last probably minute and a half. So I'm going to open a big can of worms before we sign off for the evening. And if you have any questions after this is done and you want to post a comment on this video, I'll check this video as well next week when we do the Ask Me Anything, and we'll go into that as well. So should Christians use their vote to advance their faith agenda and diminish other faiths' agendas? And this gets into a sticky situation even within Christian circles, where Christians feel morally conflicted. Should I be using my vote, and especially around this time in Canada, right? Should I be using my vote to push my religion on people, right? Because I don't want to push my religion on people. In this case, we live in a situation where we're allowed to vote. We're allowed to give our opinion on how things should be done. If we have opinions, our opinion matters. Just being a member of our country. To say that we aren't allowed to vote based on our religion is to say everybody's allowed to have an opinion except for religious people, which is intolerant and bigoted. Everybody's allowed to have an opinion in this sort of a society. Everybody's allowed to vote. They're allowed to vote based on, and should vote based on, their beliefs, their values, their ethic, these sorts of things. Everybody does that, so why say that religious people should be the exception? So for example, if somebody says to me, I'm allowed to speak my views, but you leave your religion at home, It's like, well, then you leave your beliefs and values at home too, right? Then nobody gets to have a say. I think it just makes sense for all of us to be voting and trying to create a situation where what we value is what we try to endorse. That seems to make the most sense to me. So as we're concluding, I know I just opened up a big can of worms. We'll probably get questions on that over the week. But as we're concluding, the P2C Plus conference is coming up over New Year's. We're going to be having 6 apologetics workshops at that. Myself and my coworkers are going to be giving those workshops. So the P2C Plus is a conference for college and university students. We'd love to see you there. Lots of sessions to enjoy, big party to enjoy, so it's a lot of fun. I've gone the past few years. Also, if you want to keep up with us, like and follow the Power to Change students. You can also go to the Ultimate Questions Facebook page and like and follow that. And if you would like someone from the Ultimate Questions apologetics team to come speak at your church or your youth group or your university group, we'd love to do that, so just get in touch with us. And next week, we're doing Ask Me Anything again on Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week, the topic is going to be the spiritual world. Do we have spirits? Can that even be argued? What about angels, demons, ghosts? All those sorts of things. So yeah, hopefully we'll see you out next week, and thanks for tuning in today.